Are women competing in the World Cup on equal footing? In Australia, the Women's World Cup kicked off along with a renewed debate on pay parity in sport, with women averaging only 25 cents for every dollar earned by a man in World Cup competition. Many say it's just not fair. But is a pay gap acceptable? And if not, what will it take to change it? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is pay parity in sports. In June, FIFA announced that for the first time, around $49 million of the record $110 million Women's World Cup prize would go directly to individual players. At least $30,000 for each participant and $270,000 to each player on the winning squad. While that $30,000 might sound like decent pay to some, it's small considering most of the women playing in the World Cup maintain part-time jobs just to support themselves. Compare that with someone like Lionel Messi, who's just signed a contract at Inter Miami for over $50 million a year after turning down an offer of over $440 million a year for Saudi team Al Hilal. And then you see how wide the gap really is. Now, the Women's World Cup is one of the biggest sporting events on the planet. Over 1 billion people are expected to tune in. Female footballers are using their platform to discuss pay parity across all sports. Now, it's been 4 years since the U.S. won the Women's World Cup to cheers of equal pay, and this year's co-hosts are picking up the baton. Australia has thrust the issue of gender equity back onto soccer's biggest stage, calling out gender disparity in World Cup prize money.
2007 was the first World Cup I played in, and it was the first time FIFA awarded prize money to women. 25 years after the men.
In 2010, we fought for our first CBA with basic pay. We won the Asian Cup and went back to our part-time jobs.
In 2013, we signed a new deal to make sure we got our laundry done for us.
In 2015, FIFA made us play the World Cup on artificial pitches. The grass was fake and the disrespect was real.
Later that year, we took a stand for some real progress in our next CBA back home. Just like we do on the pitch, we stuck together, refused to back down, and got the result.
Now we're treated as serious professionals with fairness and respect that women deserve.
Well, let's get the perspective now of one of the Women's World Cup players, and Chinyelu Asher joins us. She plays for the Jamaican national team and has been an advocate for equal pay. Thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. First, just bring us up to speed on, exactly where you stand, why you appreciate what the U.S. national team has achieved, and if or how that could be scaled internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. team, they've been massive, absolutely massive trailblazers for us women's players. And they had to take their case. I think it was like a accumulation of 5 years, in court. And so we're so grateful for them for kind of pushing that standard and showing the rest of the world, where we need to progress to as well.
I want to play something for you that a well-known female athlete actually said when the pay parity debate really kicked off in Australia a few years back. So this is UFC fighter Ronda Rousey being asked what she makes of the push for equal pay in women's soccer. Here's what she said.
I think that how much you get paid should have something to do with how much money you bring in. I'm the highest paid fighter, not because Dina and Lorenzo wanted to do something nice for the ladies. They do it because I bring in the highest numbers. They do it because I make them the most money. And I think that the money that they make should be proportionate to the money that they bring in. Okay, so does she have a point there, or does her position as a UFC fighter not really compare to the team sport of women's soccer?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say it's two completely different industries. Kudos to her and her career, and she's definitely built, her wealth and her income. But I think for women's football, I think we can kind of compare it to, unfortunately, right now, it's still kind of in like a startup phase. And I feel as though the money and the revenue can only come in as much as we are planning and creating space for that revenue to come in. And, a big slogan being repeated a lot this year is, build the stadiums, people will come, bring the money in, you will find that, that revenue coming in. And I think with the women's game right now, we're still a little bit behind. We're still a little bit a step behind when you look at the amount of promotion. A lot of the sponsorships that came in for this tournament was very last minute, and it just kind of kills the momentum. It kills the possible revenue and money that can come in when we're seeing so much viewership, so much representation of these players on the global scene. So yeah. I think we need to kind of generate that infrastructure. We need people in the positions that are making these decisions and that have the foresight to plan ahead and kind of plan as though this is an incredibly growing business, and not be so last minute, because it kills a lot of the progress that we're trying to make.
Got it. Tell me, for you, what makes women's football so great? What is drawing these huge crowds? And when did it hit you personally that, the pay gap, it just wasn't fair, it just wasn't right?
Yeah, well, personally, I mean, I'm still a professional footballer, at this moment, so it hits you almost immediately. Especially for me, coming out of the U.S. college infrastructure, where you do experience a lot of equality in that domain, just in terms of resources, especially playing at some of the better programs. You're thrusted out into the professional scene, and even in the NWSL, like, they've made huge progress over the last couple of years, and trying to raise salaries and raise conditions, but you're just immediately seeing the differences in income, the differences in support and sponsorships and investments, and it's a big wake-up call. And I think what makes women's football so attractive right now is just how much we are in the genesis of something new. I think if you look at the men's game, they've had a long history, and our history of, like, the World Cup, or just as a professional sport, if you look at the timeline, we've made so much progress with so little resource and with such a little amount of time. I think it's just the audience that hasn't been
and we have to remember,
connected with.
Yeah, and it was banned. The sport itself, women were banned from playing football in developed countries for decades.
Exactly. Yeah. And even, I mean, if you look in Saudi Arabia, I mean, up in, I think, in 2017, women weren't even allowed to come to their football games,
And now we have something like 190 nations with national teams.
Exactly. And every single time there's a limit kind of placed as to our expectations. Yeah. And with every major tournament, we exceed it. Tickets inspiring. Are sold out. The first game, 80,000, stadiums sold out. So I definitely agree. If we build the space, people will come and fill it and push this game even further.
Tell me this, though. There are those that argue that this is a meritocracy, in that men are just better athletes. If you pit the women's soccer champions against the men's champions, they're going to lose. And that sports is a male-dominated industry in the way that fashion might be a female-dominated industry. You don't have male models making nearly as much as the female models, so that's kind of just the way it is. And it's a meritocracy in that sense. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think football is football, period. And I think, I know I keep repeating this word of infrastructure, but it's so important in this dialogue, because when you look at how the infrastructure for men's football and the academies, the youth systems, all those resources, obviously, at this age, at this year, the football is going to look different. And I think for people that have been following women's football for the past few decades, you can see, just a progressive line of quality, and also just new generations of ballers coming out. And that has only been coming out because of that same progress and increase of investment, of resources, of fields, of support, of all those things. So, yeah, I mean, of course, if we kind of distill that argument down to those things, I mean, sure. But I think we really have to pay attention to the timelines and the amount of resources created to produce the product in the end.
Chinyelu Asher.
And I mean, oh yeah, yeah.
No, so sorry to interrupt you. That's really unfortunately
okay.
all the time we have for this segment. It was really great to have you.
No
Thanks
problem.
so much for joining us.
I can talk about this all day. Thank you. Yeah.
I get it. Thanks so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. We appreciate it. You too. Well, let's broaden out the debate now. And joining me from Brisbane, Australia is Heather Reid. She is the director of the NGO Women Onside and a former board member of Football Australia. From Birmingham, UK, Ellis Cashmore is the author of Studying Football. And joining us from the state of Indiana is Kim Crowder, a diversity and inclusion consultant and CEO at Kim Crowder Consulting. Thanks all so much for being with me. Ellis, I'll start with you. I mean, you seem to think the argument is pretty simple here. The market dictates what players are paid, but we've seen also that the market can follow the money, and higher salaries for athletes makes them an easier sell. So we need to pay women more first, and then the market will equalize. We actually just heard Chinyelu Asher make that similar argument. You don't agree?
In a properly run world, yes, but we don't live in a properly run world. This is a clash between morals and the market. Morally speaking, obviously, I mean, any right-minded person would expect women to be paid the same as men for the same duties, the same roles, the same tasks as they do in all other spheres of society. And I'm not being naive now, by the way, Andrea. I know that that gender gap hasn't closed completely, but we have been squeezing it decade after decade since the 1970s. So we are at least approaching some kind of equality. That's the moral side of the argument, and it's completely justifiable. The market side of the argument is a bit different, and that is that the women have come to football late. 3 decades or more ago, they weren't even allowed to play football in some parts of the world. Right. And so the growth in popularity of the women's game has been exponential in recent years, and will continue, I think, not exponentially, but will continue to grow in popularity. But sport, like a great many other areas of society, is driven by finance. And the media supply the money. The media, in concert with sponsors, make the likes of the Olympics, the World Cups, the World Athletics Championships, tennis's Grand Slams. Money from broadcasters makes all this possible. And so when the organizers of the World Cup, FIFA, say, OK, we want X amount of money from TV companies and streamers for you to show the games live and legally. Broadcasters will think twice about it because they're not sure that they can get advertisers interested.
Let me turn to the U.S., though. Kim, you know, is the United States in the women's football context then a bit of an anomaly or an outlier? Because in the U.S., people know the names of women's soccer stars like, you know, Megan Rapinoe. They appear on late-night talk shows. They appear on the covers of magazines. Men's soccer stars in the U.S. really don't. But swap over to Europe, and the reverse is actually true. So when you're looking at the U.S. and how women's soccer in particular plays out, is it genuinely unfair, and can that market argument that Ellis makes really not be applied there?
What's interesting about the U.S. is because of the women's soccer team, we say women's soccer team, we have a different name for football. The women footballers here in the U.S. fought for that. And they got a lot of visibility through those 5 years about 5 years where they were fighting the courts. They were being invited to talk about it on television. And that's why we know their names. We don't know their names necessarily before that because of what soccer was doing. They said, hey, we're valuable. We win more games than our men. We certainly play more games, and we should be paid accordingly. And so that's what we're seeing. And then when we take a look at what's happening overseas, I want to actually address some of the things that were said prior. Women didn't come to the football field late. Women were allowed to be a part of that. We use that language. I always think that language, the way we frame that, is so important. And unfortunately, when you look at 25 cents to the dollar, that is terrifying to me. We see this across in work across the world, right, for women, period. But when you think about just how low that is, yes, it is a conversation about morality. It's got to be a conversation about where we stand. We need more young girls to see that they belong in football. And the way to do that is to start putting good faith out front so that that happens now.
Okay, let me turn to Heather over in Australia. And I have to say, ironically, you know, when we look at the U.S., the best-known male soccer players in the United States really had to be imported. We had David Beckham playing for Los Angeles. Now Lionel Messi is heading to Miami. But Heather, if you can, talk to us about the Australian context, because it's been a real battle in Australia, and it's all been on display now in the Women's World Cup underway in the country as well. I mean, tell us what the battle has been there and what's really been exposed. Having watched what the U.S. teams have been dealing with and what the Australian teams have dealt with.
Yes, thank you. Look, I give a lot of credit to the US team and, in fact, US soccer generally, because if it wasn't for them pushing, first of all, to have a World Cup along with other people from Europe back in the late 80s, and then, of course, having Olympic status with the first Olympic Games for women being Atlanta, they were huge decisions that were made, actually all announced within the same week in 1993 that women's soccer would be included in the Olympics. And the biggest thing for us was that Australia would host the 2000 Olympics. And it's probably since 1999, before that Olympics, that our national team, affectionately known as the Matildas, actually went onto the world stage when they released a rather controversial nude calendar. They did that for two reasons. One was to raise revenue for the team, because in those days they were still paying to play, paying to represent their country. And the second thing was to get greater recognition for the name, for their brand, for their team. And now we see 24 years later, the Matildas are the second highest popular team in this country. So many people know Sam Kerr, Steph Catley, Carpenter, Raso. They can name the players. And it gives me goosebumps thinking about this World Cup and thinking about the market versus morals. The market here is saying that people want to see women play football. It's one of those things that you can flip that you can't be what you can't see to you can be what you can see. And thousands and millions of people are tuning in to watch this game. And a lot of those people are seeing high quality football for the first time. And I'll just get some stats for you. There's an average of over 30,000 fans per game. The record broadcasting audience numbers exceeding 8 million broadcast viewers, 106 million minutes of content so far in this tournament, 1.7 million ticket sales. For countries like Australia and New Zealand, that's phenomenal, exceeding our targets of 1.2 million ticket sales. They took it to 1.5. It's now at 1.7.
Well, let me come back to Ellis then, because you're kind of hearing the other side of the argument that you made, Ellis, and maybe there is, you know, just a different context right now in Australia and the United States, especially when it comes again to women's football. Do you accept that at least, or are you still on the page that, you know, it's never really going to match up to what the men can bring in for the same
I'll take
sport?
the two contexts, Andrew. First of all, the United States, obviously, there really isn't a presence for association football over there. They have the MLS, but basically the behemoths of sport in the US are American football, NFL, of course, basketball and baseball.
When it comes to soccer, though, I mean, they've tried, but you know they've tried. I mean, come on, in the 70s, they brought over Pele at global record pay to the New York, and that didn't work. Then they brought over Beckham.
But the competitions, yeah. So basically, Andrea, association football is predominantly a woman's sport in the United States, which is absolutely fine, and nobody argues with that. And they have dominated women's football since the outset of since the first World Cup, 1990. In Australia, I think the situation is slightly different because we're not talking about a gigantic population. We're 20 million in Australia and New Zealand, less than 6 million people. So in terms of advertisers, they're not particularly interested in that. And I'm playing the devil's advocate on purpose, by the way, Andrea. This is not something I earnestly believe in. I'm just trying to understand why there is this resistance to paying women as much as men in the same game. Additionally, and this is a big variable that nobody's raised so far, that is that there is no collective agreements in the mainstays of the game in Western Europe and South America. Individual players negotiate their own bonuses and salaries. They all have agents and they all do individual deals. Only last weekend, Jordan Henderson signed for a Saudi Arabia club, leaving England for an annual salary of £36 million sterling. Now, there is no female player in the world that the Saudis would pay that kind of money for, because again, the market dictates the value of individual players. So as much as I'm agreeing with my colleagues that this is morally wrong, I'm simply establishing the facts of the situation.
You know, we only have a few minutes left. Let me come back to Kim, because one of the points to be made here is actually what's so special about the Women's World Cup and women's football now is that almost, we mentioned before, 200 countries almost have national teams, including Morocco, who sent its first women's team to the World Cup this year, and they hosted the Women's Africa Cup of Nations as well. We've now got China investing more in women's soccer than in men's. We were making the argument before that if you invest the money, the fans will come, that relationship. So, I mean, what does it say about uplifting women, not just in the United States, but across the world, when more is invested in them, Kim?
Yeah, you know, I think that this is a gateway into a larger conversation about women's sports overall, right? And I'm going to be very honest, in the U.S., seeing that women's soccer is the forerunner in this conversation, considering when we talk about what sports are most popular in the U.S., I was actually delighted that it was sort of like this sneaky attack of this team saying, we don't want that anymore. The benefit of that team is that they did get, for instance, we think about HBO Max. And so they got a documentary special, right? It raised awareness. There was an engine behind this soccer team in the US for people to be educated about what is happening. And so the more we can see those engines behind the scenes that are basically pushing the conversation forward in any country, the better. The more that women collectively stand across with each other, the better around this, right? The more that they have those conversations and learn how to organize. This is basic community grassroots organizing that the U.S. soccer team took to, their own sport. And so it has been really beautiful to watch. And it sparked a conversation about equal pay for women in sports in the United States, not just in soccer, but across the board.
Right. Heather, we're down to our last literally 2 minutes. And if you could speak to that, because you're witnessing the World Cup in Australia right now, and we've never seen a more international tournament in this space than what we're seeing in Australia and New Zealand. And the fact that countries that never had women's national teams before, and where it is somewhat controversial in some senses, now playing the field. I mean, how much does that say about how far this sport and women have come?
Look, it's brilliant. I was at the first World Cup when there were only 12 teams and 67 nations, I think, were going for those final 12 spots. Now we've had over 170 nations going for 32 spots. We thought moving from 24 places in the finals to 32 would be a bridge too far. But the newcomers in this tournament have been absolutely stunning. And I agree with Kim. You have to put in the investment. This argument about, women don't deserve the payment, the equal payment or equitable payment because they don't bring in as much money is tired, it's stale, and it needs to change. The people who can change that sort of situation are the decision makers. So we have to get to the governance structures within every single member federation of FIFA and FIFA itself. Our federation has made a commitment for equity between the Socceroos and the Matildas. Other federations have done that as well in Scandinavia and New Zealand and elsewhere. It's a commitment that must be made by the decision makers. They have the power to change this, and it needs to change very soon.
Okay. That, unfortunately, will have to be the end of this discussion for this edition of the Newsmakers. Really great to have you all. Let me thank Heather Reid, Ellis Cashmore, and Kim Crowder. Fantastic conversation. I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic soon, maybe just after the World Cup finishes when we know who the champions are. But for this time, thanks so much for being with us. And thanks, of course, to our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter or X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.